welcome back to the Collin Cadmus Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Jacco van der Kooij. Jacco is originally from the Netherlands. He started his career in 1994 at Philips Electronics as a project manager and then transitioned into sales. Since then, he's led sales for over 10 different companies prior to starting his current company, Winning by Design, where they help B2B SaaS companies design, build, and scale their sales efforts. Jacco's voice in sales is respected globally as an author, keynote speaker, and across all social media. I've been following his content for as long as I've been in sales. If you're not, you should be too. I could easily talk to him for weeks without running out of topics or questions, but today we're going to dive in and focus on one specific topic that Jacco believes to be the number one issue facing SaaS companies today, and that's the declining efficiency of go-to-market performance. In the last 3 episodes, we talked a lot about this subject, so it's close to my heart, but to keep things simple, I've divided the episode into 4 questions, and I'm excited to dive in. Jacco, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Collin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Likewise. I'm a longtime fan and excited to chat it up with you. These are topics that I've sort of been, barely scratching the surface on, so to speak, but they're near and dear to my heart because I feel like I've kind of seen a lot of this coming over the years. I'm sure you have as well, but you have taken a much deeper dive into all of this. So I've kept the questions kind of high level and we'll kind of let you, run in whatever direction you want. Before we dive in, I'll give a quick sort of overview of the 4 questions so people know what to expect. The first question is going to be, what is the growth at all cost mindset, otherwise known as GaaC? What, if anything, is broken with the GaaC model and why is now time for change? And then we'll dive into what needs to change. And then if we have time, I'd like to also ask you, because this is the big thing that I'm curious about, will there be a return of GaaC? Is this sort of a cyclical, financial, economic type of thing? And will that end up, sort of coming back when money becomes cheap again? So without further ado, let's dive in. I think many people know this, but it's good to just start with the basics. So what is growth at all cost mindset or model? How do you define that?
Well, thank you for asking that question. Growth at all cost mindset is literally what it does, what it stands for. And you grow and you keep growing at such a high cost that you don't care about it. Now, why is this important? Companies, primarily startup companies, and of those startup companies, even more so software startup companies, are primarily valued based on growth. Growth outvalues the element of costs up to several billions of dollars. And that means that investors, in the days that money was cheap, so to speak, in other words, interest rates were low on that money or 0% for a certain point in time, what it allowed for is that they would say, go sell, hire more people, launch more campaigns, launch a new go-to-market motion with no looking at the cost. Do not worry about the cost. Just keep growing, growing, growing. And when that money was funded, when you got that money for free, that worked really well. So that's growth at all costs. It values growth at a higher rate than cost.
Got it. So this ties in really well. For those who have listened to previous episodes, I did an episode where I didn't do an interview. I did a couple episodes where I just went on rants about a couple topics. And the first one was Silicon Valley collapse, basically. And what I talked about there and what I've been sort of referring to this as is sort of the VC narrative game. Now, I'm not sure if this strikes on anything for you, but sort of what I've seen through my time, in startup land is that a lot of what we do seems to be less about profit or building a great business. It's about sort of driving this narrative. And the narrative is to keep raising the valuation of the business, right? And so to your point, it's been about growth. Can we just keep adding new customers, even if we're spending $3 to earn $1? If we can sort of keep that narrative going, and what I mean by that is every time we meet with the VCs and we want to raise our next round of funding, as long as we can get them to value the business higher than it was before, then we're winning. And it doesn't really matter if anything else is sustainable long term. And I know people don't like this phrase, but I say it resembles a lot of what a Ponzi scheme is, because if you can't keep pouring that money in on top, eventually the thing just doesn't work and it goes belly up because you need to keep adding that growth capital. And so I've preached a lot about that, sort of just the financial aspect of, sort of how I think we've gotten to this place. And to your point, if money is cheap, then you can sort of keep that thing going. And eventually maybe it will become profitable. I think probably a lot of these companies end up getting acquired and they never really become profitable, or they get acquired by Salesforce or whatever, just so they can throw it away and not compete with it. So a lot of that stuff happens, but you've dove in much deeper into like what's actually happening at the level of the company rather than just why it's happening. And whether you agree or disagree on some of the financial stuff, I think is probably moot point. But what I'm curious to get more out of on you, unless you want to comment on any of that there, I want to know what's broken with GaaC today. Obviously, I think it's got a lot to do with the financial cycles, but you've dove into sort of the details there. So I'd love to hear from you what you think is most broken and sort of what you're doing or suggesting to people to focus on today.
Collin, so, like a lot of the topics you talk about, there's a lot of emotion behind it as I hear you speak about it, right? And a lot of like the strong opinion of, because you have seen certain things. I encourage you and the listeners to not think of it that way. I encourage you and the listeners to think of it as follows. As a human being, you go through phases in life. You go through like whatever, 0 to 10, you grow up, you learn how to do to stand and walk on your own. And then you become, like in your teenage years. And your teenage years is a very emotional time. You go through a lot of like ups and downs, and then you become an early adult, your first job, and then eventually, kids, family, debt, and from houses and whatnot, or from a house that you buy, and so on and so forth. We are currently in the phase, we're ending the phase of teenage years. And the period that we went through the last decade, which, like often is referred to as the golden age of SaaS, right? From 2012 to about 2022. These are just the teenage years. And when you become an adult, you got to look back at the teenage years and say, those were the years that formed me. Those were the years that formed my character. And so too. Does that mean that we can skip teenage years? No, we can't. We have to go through that period of time. We mature out of it. And in that world, we are now maturing out of growth at all costs as SaaS. Like so many other businesses that grew before us, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's healthcare, all those businesses have gone through this stage, and we're simply maturing out of that. And what we're maturing into is a more scientific approach, the same way that manufacturing had started to look at processes, the same way that hospitals had to embrace processes, so too is SaaS maturing out of the relatively teenage years, not immature years, no, teenage years, in where we learned what worked and what doesn't.
I like that. And it's interesting. You define golden age as 2012 to 2022. Those are the years I was in SaaS. I literally joined in 2012. The first company I joined had just been acquired for $100 million. So I really did live through that. But I like the way you're looking at it. And it makes sense because you have more experience than me. So you lived prior, you saw prior to those years, whereas I sort of have that limited scope. But it sounds like, if I'm understanding this correctly, and I agree with you, the part that I'm probably have been most focused on is sort of, to your point, it's the emotional piece. It's how do we point fingers? Is there someone to blame? But sounds like maybe what you're saying is this is just part of the evolution, and maybe it takes an economic downturn or something to sort of trigger these different phases. Like when you graduate high school and you go to college, it's going to trigger a lot of growth, right? You're sort of getting forced into that. So I like that. And it makes sense why you're able to, I think, dissect this so much deeper than me. You've been able to look past the emotional side of it, which is great.
Yeah, I think that, look, now we know what it is. Now we can say we stand on the shoulders of that. Were there during our teenage years, AKA the growth at all cost period, were there some, like things that we wish we hadn't done? Were there some pictures that we wish we hadn't taken? Were there some parties that we wish we didn't drink as much? Absolutely, those moments have happened. Don't get me wrong. But in the end, we stand on the shoulders of those years, and we move forward. And where we, and we can take some pride in that. Like, look, one of those typical topics is outbound emailing, spamming, automation, sequence creation, and whatnot. Folks, that was a logical outcome from the first Marketo and Eloqua campaigns, and it just progressed itself. And moving forward, AI will continue to play a role and automate that. And it's, we will have elements of that, obviously. But if we go beyond that, now where we go beyond is that phase 2. And so what was your second question?
It's really what's broken with that model today, and why is now the time for change? So sort of what do you view as the broken and the solution? And I guess around the timing, what has triggered that? I think you kind of answered the second part there, which is we're growing up, we're evolving. And I guess maybe it's a moot point what triggered it. It maybe doesn't really matter so much.
Okay, what is broken is as follows. When we launched SaaS, we launched that on the backs. If you go back, we launched that on the backs of what is an upgrade and support contract of a perpetual software license. So if you go the way back all the way late 1990s, early 2000s, we're selling hardware. Hardware needed to be upgraded with software. Software was, in those first years, software was valued as something that you got on a disk drive, on a small floppy disk along with your systems. And right. Over time, they became CDs that were like stacked on the shelf, literally defining the term shelfware.
Yeah.
And what had happened, what happened is that when we started selling software, we paid, like X million dollars of software up front. And then every 3 to 5 years, we needed to change that software. But software came out with updates, therefore we needed, like frequent updates, and therefore we came up with the upgrade and support contract, paid 20% per year, 20%. We had, every customer had their own software package. Lo and behold, if we now give everybody the same software package, it only needs to be engineered once. We can skip the upfront cost. Remaining is the 20% upgrade and support fees. Voila, SaaS is born, right? And nowadays that is in $10,000, $20,000 packages and so on and so forth. That changed. Now, what changed here? Number one thing changed. We pushed one piece of software on a server, centralized AWS server in the cloud, and we accessed that one piece of software. Previously, every customer had their own software package with their own features and their own code, which all create all kinds of permutations. The number one thing, centralized software on a centralized drive. Number two things, I am now changing the pricing model. In other words, I'm going from upfront fee to annual subscription, or nowadays to consumption and usage model.
And to clarify, the old, and this I think was referred to as on-prem software, right? Because you basically had to install it on premises. And so the business model for some of the younger folks listening, as he said, you would literally go to a store, a software store, and buy a box of software. You would bring the disk home and put it into a computer. And it was sort of the same concept at a bigger scale for businesses. But the business model was that you would eventually upgrade that software, right? And you would try to sell them the next version, so to speak.
Yeah, often what they refer to it is on-prem, we refer to hardware as in the physical drive that we ship, and the drive could contain the software. But physically, like a pallet full of routers, right? Cisco, you're shipping metal to a site. And then with software, it is more common to call that perpetual license. In other words, you buy it once and you own it into perpetuity. And, Now, but
it becomes outdated over time.
Outdated over time,
right.
Or some of them age out after a decade or something like that. But but what happened here is like that model, right? Like I have only one form of software and it sits in the cloud, and I am selling it at a different pricing structure, only a variable cost rather than a upfront cost. There was a third part that we did not take a look at, and that third part is the wall we're hitting. When I'm selling $1 million piece of software or $10 million piece of software, because in those early days, SAP and so on, and we had a company in the Netherlands, company called Baan Software, BAAN, they were the early competitors in this market. And what they did is they paid salespeople from the get-go 10% of the cost of the product that they sell. So if you sold $10 million, a deep enterprise salesperson would get $1 million check. And this happened across the boards, SAPs, Oracle, and so on. They were selling software like that. Salespeople, therefore, got a comp plan, often $250,000 to $500,000 was very common. Like by the time I left sales, like $350,000, $450,000 were often what the average salesperson made. $550,000, $600,000 was a good, and the great salespeople made $750,000, $900,000.
And this is pre-2000s. You're talking in the 90s.
In the late 1990s, but early mid-2000s, 2003, 4, 5. Now, mind you, that in those years, right, software was new and was sold and seen as a high profit margin product, right? But now what we are doing, we're changing the business model. Now we're changing it to SaaS. What you'll see what happened historically, we changed the salespeople because we can't afford, if I sell, like the same package, which often nowadays, creates a lot of complexity. If I sell $200,000 software package, which is a high-end enterprise software package, I can't sell 10 of that a year. That's really hard for a salesperson. You can do like 4 or 5 a year. So you can bring in about $1 million, $1.5 million. Now, recurring value on that is about 5 to 6x, right? Because you're anticipated to bring that in for multiple years. But you can't pay the person on that because the person, the check needs to be cashed in the subsequent 5, 6 years. So now you need to pay that salesperson, and you can't pay him $500,000 on selling $200,000 sales package. And I'm exaggerating now, just for effects, right? So that means that the model is wrong. So we had to do in SaaS, you saw a few things happen. Number one, they started to embrace the inside sales model. And the inside sales model is salespeople on the phone at a lower cost. Early days, SDRs operated at $35,000, $25,000 to $35,000. Number two, we are using technology, email in the early days. Hey, the fact that I can email somebody, where previously I had to call them. Later on, Zoom sessions, automated email sequences. All this was technology that made this easier accessible now to a person who got paid less. And then what we started to see is we started to bring on talent earlier on in their career. If you go back to the late 1990s, mid 2000s, the sales trade of enterprise sales, we didn't have a lot of SMB sales. It was all enterprise sales. And that trade was primarily done by what they call gray foxes and gray tops, people with gray hair on the top, right? And as a result, you often had 20, 30 years of experience selling that. That's what got it. That's how we got here.
So it wasn't really an entry-level career path in that day and age.
Absolutely not. Yeah. No. Like in my case, it took me like a decade in order to get somewhere, right? Like it takes years. And then, you have to understand your education takes place once a year at the sales kickoff, right? Sales training is not something that happens. It just happens throughout your career. And you often do that by traveling with your VP of sales. He or she shows you particular tricks. And then, if you do enough trips after enough years, plus enough SKOs, sales kickoffs, annual sales kickoffs, decade in, 15 years in, you get the hang of it, right? And you age up into the brackets for seniority.
Right.
But that takes a while, 50 to 20 years of experience.
Sure.
And deep enterprise sales really had a certain complexity to it. A lot of visits, on-site body language reading, all these things were, how do you sit each other at the table? Are we sitting on one side, opposite sides? Where's the meeting? Right? Like all that was techniques that we were skilled in those days.
Mirroring and matching, all this stuff, right?
Mirroring and matching we still do in online, but we can't read what's off the picture, so to speak, right?
From here up, we do it, right? Yes. From the waist up, yeah.
And so here we are, and this is where growth at all costs now came from. This is where it's sourced from. Now, because I'm selling at the lower SaaS product, and because I catch people earlier on in their career where they don't have the skill set, I start to leverage technology. The fact that they can do online, which was a well match with the age group, like Zoom sessions and whatnot. And I age a higher velocity sale, which primarily during the golden years was as follows. You're currently buying some software at $1 million package. I can sell it to you for $5,000 a month. In this case, the main sales pitch was the value prop of the economic model, not what the product could or could not do. Because AWS says it's 5 nines. All the technical expertise that was needed in the early days was wiped out simply by saying, oh, we're sitting on an Amazon server somewhere. Oh, you're on the Amazon cloud? Yes. And then everybody knew, okay, the Amazon cloud's 5 nines. This is how you interface with it. No longer part of the conversation. And so the sales pitch simplified. The salary came down to what nowadays would be between $150,000 to $180,000.
And it sounds like a sort of a big expansion into SMB, or almost a pivot, right? Where SMB sort of became the bulk of a lot of this.
And that's right. And the reason why is as follows. If I sell $10 million, give you an idea, you have to see the scale of how things changed. I was working for a company that was scaled, ready to go IPO when the .com bubble burst. That company filed an S1 on 80 customers, 80, of which about 20 were recurring. Okay. Nowadays, going IPO on 80 customers, you must be a highly technology-driven company, right? You better have because nowadays when you go IPO, we're talking easily hundreds, but more likely thousands, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 customers. And
Right.
so what you'll see is that companies like OneStream, who went public like 2 weeks ago, they have like well over 1,000 customers, right? Like that is an indication of the scale difference that has occurred these days, right? Instead of 80, we're now talking about like 20 times as much. Because that volume goes up, there's not enough enterprise companies to sell to in the world, and therefore you step lower and you're looking at like SMB companies. Now, what we today define as enterprise is not the same as what we did historically. Today we say, oh, SMB is like people with 2,000 or 5,000 employees and above, where previously deep enterprise sales looks at like, oh, over 50,000 companies with employees, over 50,000 employees. Different world.
Yeah.
Now, that's what I'm seeing. We're maturing now out of that growth at all costs. We're maturing out of that mindset. And what we're maturing into is a more scientific, more mature approach, which equates to a more scientific approach.
How much of that do you think is the competition a big part of it too? In other words, is there's so much on the market today that it's sort of pushing us in this direction?
Obviously, yes. Like if you go back, and there's plenty of examples historically. If you go back to if you were somebody had to do with horsemanship, right, in the early 1900s before the car came, there were like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, whatever. How many people were having a horse hoof, whatever your horsemanship's skills needed, right? And they nowadays are very few people who have that skill, right? Whaling was another one before we invented kerosene oil and stuff like that. The whaling oil that was used was a whole business. Ice cube making was all, folks, we're in the same thing. We saw this huge rise of SaaS in the need. We have tens of thousands of companies. We measured it to be over 35,000. We're now going to see a bunch of those companies are going to merge and acquire and collapse, and some will exist and some will not exist. And we're going to see more new mature companies coming out. Completely normal, just part of the evolution. And it's going to be, it's going to be an exciting next decade.
Yeah, it's getting flipped upside on its head, it seems like. So what are you sort of pushing as the solution, right? When you're speaking with companies are sort of up against this, maybe they have to pivot away from growth at all costs. Maybe they have to, strive for profitability more now, or maybe they just want to try to head in the right direction. What's the biggest piece essentially that you see is changing? Maturation
of your processes. That's the number one thing. So when you mature as a company, your maturation is the maturation of processes. Now, when you roll, if you find yourself rolling your eyes at that, right? Which, I would definitely do myself if I go back not too far ago, then, then that's primarily because your business is still in an early stage. And in an early stage, you don't want to mature processes too soon. And let's put the marker at $10 million in recurring revenue. Before that, processes can stand in the way of evolution, and the quick progress of evolution is called revolution. So like quick progress, we need that before 10 million. Once you start to surpass $10 million, you'll see that the company needs to mature. Any $10 million business that your brother, your sister, your uncle, your parents, or your children run, you would consider a mature business, 10 million. So too in software, and that means you need to mature your processes. And that primarily means maturing the processes. I mean, putting things down, doing more of what works and stop doing what doesn't work. A process is not something highly complex. A process simply is putting a series of actions that have proven to work in the right order. So when you do them again in the same order, they deliver the same result. Got it. So maybe we can jump in a little bit to some specifics on outbound here. Do you see anything big that needs to change? I mean, obviously we have AI coming into the play. It seems like there's also just an increased resistance from the consumer, to accepting cold calls or spam emails, whether it's that they're blocking them on their phone or they're using apps to sort of filter these things out. And then you also have Google, who's, putting more restrictions in place on how many emails we can send, things like that. What do you see going on there? What do you think is the future of outbound in that regard? Yeah, the future is, when you look at it, currently our conversion rates from a lead to an opportunity have fallen well below 1% for most companies. Meaning I need more than reach out to 100 people in order to find one who is of interest to me, right? And then who has an interest in me. And those often by themselves, can cause issues, because if they churn too fast, then, it's not healthy for me either. I need to keep this customer long enough for me to make a enough profit that it not only pays for the rest of the organization, but also hits my profit margins the right way. That means in generally that you're looking at 1 in 1,000, so to speak, today, 1 in 1,000 that you need to call on. And that 1,000 doesn't, like they don't answer to one single email, right? Like, so you need to send, let's say on average, 18 emails, whatever it is nowadays, it's some astronomical number. So you can imagine what kind of email volume you start to have to create. That seems ludicrous in a world that we live in. Now, if you sell to 7 billion human beings on Earth, you can do that because you have enough human beings that you can go through. But in the world that we live in, most companies that we work with, and we have about 1,100 customers these days. If you look at that, most customers' universe is defined by about 5,000 customers. 5,000 is like in B2B sales is what defines you. Now, I'm not saying that you cannot be selling to another 20,000 SMBs or 30,000. I get that. But about 5,000 of them will bring you the lion's share of your revenue, right? Like, and that's the Pareto rule, 20-80% there. Right. And so those 5,000, now what you need to do is instead of looking at all the tens of thousands and like you need to go is how do I identify those 5,000 and how do I create a quality campaign rather than a quantity campaign? And in many cases, you're going to find that in today's world that has to do more with networking, that has to do more with in-person meetings, that has to do a lot more with less volume at a higher quality. And that, in person also starts to play a role in. And we're going to continue to see that, Collin, that due to the rise of AI, human beings trust AI less and less. Is the video real? Is the email real? Is the text message real? Is the phone call even real? And so we're going to see the rise of in-person communication, trade shows, and so on and so forth to determine is the buyer on the other side and the seller on the side, are they real people?
Interesting. So that's the first time I think I've heard that take. So you think, I've heard people say we're going to see a rise of sort of some in-person stuff, but I haven't heard someone voice it in the notion that it's because people trust AI less. So I've actually been a little bit in the school of camp that we're going to evolve to a place where we trust AI more. Do you think we're headed there? And today it's more of like the lack of trust of AI is more because they're questioning, am I actually speaking to an AI or am I speaking to a human? Whereas I think where I'm thinking is a bit of a different thought, which is, that we will establish a level of trust in the accuracy of information we get from like a chat GPT or something like that. And so we're sort of saying two different things, but I wonder if that meets in the middle somewhere, so let me rephrase that. If salespeople are reaching out today, you're getting an email, you're getting a cold call, you're saying the consumer is hesitant to say, I don't even know if this is real, right? Are these videos deep fakes? Like same thing problems we have with our media today, right? So we don't know what is real and what isn't. And so there'll be a push to in-person, you're saying, for buyers who really want that comfort. They want to know who to trust, who to buy from. I'd imagine this to be even more prevalent when buying expensive software in the enterprise. Does that get leapfrogged at a certain point when people develop a stronger level of trust in the accuracy and perhaps the lack of bias that they may receive from an AI? In other words, to sum that up, is AI going to replace the seller at a certain point and buyers are just logging into a sales chat GPT and they're saying, hey, here's the problem I need to solve and tell me my options and you're not earning a commission, so I trust you? Or do you see it the opposite, whereas what you're saying is people are going to just gravitate to meeting in person more often?
Okay, so there's a lot of takes on that. So and like it's not this or that. It's all and. The other day I did a simple exercise, and my wife and I were talking about in the car on a long car ride. We're talking about communities and how important communities are, but that historically we already know what communities are because religions are the foundation of communities. If you go all the way back hundreds to thousands of years. And so I'm Googling up what are the biggest religious communities, right? And it gives me, I think, Christianity is still number one, Muslim is number two, and so on. It gives me, like all the religions ranked in order based on the amount of, and they don't call it followers, but when you practice religion, they have a particular term for that, right? And I noticed that, like at the bottom of the top 10, there's a couple of religions who only have 100,000. But I'm missing Jehovah's Witnesses and I'm missing Mormon in there. And I'm thinking to myself, well, those religions are in the millions, I believe, right? And so I'm asking ChatGPT now, is like, hey, well, how many Mormons followers are in the world, right? And they go like, I think 7 or 8 million or something like that. And I go like, well, why didn't you mention that in the list, right? And they go like, oh yeah, that's right. They should be in the list. And I did the same thing with Jehovah's. Oh yeah, that's right. That should be in the list. Okay. So what I'm going to depict to you is the term enterprise grade. What we're currently seeing is that AI is consumer grade, not enterprise grade. If I bring out a solution and I trust AI and it makes these kind of ridiculous mistakes, I cannot trust it in the enterprise. I cannot trust it to serve our video communication down on here, right? I mean, is AI a cool tool that we can write better with? Absolutely. Is it enterprise grade? Absolutely not. Not at least to the versions that we, as in the B2B space. Obviously, behind the scenes, I'm certain that when you have access to the core kernels and that you'll get a higher quality signal. But us paying $20 a month for a ChatGPT license are not getting any of that, right?
Yeah, I think a large part of the problem, and I've heard people refer to that as that it hallucinates, that it thinks it's saying something that is correct, but you can quickly ask a follow-up question. And I get that all the time. And it'll be like, oh no, I was wrong. Basically, that's what it's saying. And you're like, wait, now can I trust anything, that you're saying?
And so, Collin, what you just said, that's the reason why you need human-to-human communication. AI is not accountable for this. AI doesn't have accountability. AI doesn't feel guilty, right? Doesn't feel the human emotion to wake up on a Friday night, question itself, did I say the right thing to the customer, or are they going to fail over the weekend, right? Like AI doesn't have any of that.
It doesn't even apologize when it
doesn't apologize. Well,
it might tell you
it did apologize.
It might tell you to take the wrong medicine or something, and you're just like, wait, you correct it, and it just breezes over it. There's a very lack of a human element when that happens, because a human would be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I got that wrong. That was a big deal. But yeah, you're right. It's sort of missing that level of consciousness, right?
And that's right. And so now, do we think that over the next 2 to 3 years it's going to have an impact? Absolutely, right? Now, what I am going to say, and where it will replace salespeople, is if you think of a series of tasks that every sales activity has, right? Like a meeting has sending out the invite, finding a good meeting time, sending out the invitation, sending out the reminder, all that stuff, all these secondary activities is phenomenally done very well with AI, right? Like that will provide. Now, if I subdivide a full sales task and it says, oh, I have on average having 12 meetings with a customer, right? Let's say for $30,000, $40,000 sale, maybe I on average have 6 customer meetings or 12. And I divide all that up. What you're going to see that today, maybe 5% of those activities is being done with AI and automation. Then soon enough, there will be 10 and then 15 and 20 and 25. And so more and more of the mundane task will be handed off to AI and forms of automation. And more of those tasks will therefore consolidate so that the salesperson only has to work on 20 to 30% of the tasks that they used to work on. That means that as a total that we would need a significant less amount of salespeople to do the job.
Yeah.
They're not being replaced by AI. They're replaced by a process that performs better than AI, and the human being that they're being replaced with embraces that AI system to that extent, right? That is the way how this will take place, and it will evolve, but very quickly, quicker than we are anticipating.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that takes us that I said it before, 18 months to 24 months from now, we're going to see that this has a significant impact. The same way when we look now back to 18 months and 2 years ago, 18 months ago, AI hadn't come out yet, right? Yeah, just about, right? We hadn't seen it yet, but go 24 months ago, we didn't see any of this. Most of us didn't know about this. Imagine the progress that we have made already over the past 2 years and extrapolate that to the next 2 years.
I'm with you. I'm definitely with you on there's going to be less sellers, right? You're just not going to need as many because they will become more efficient at a lot of these tasks. I'm working with a couple companies, Win.ai as an example, and they're listening to your entire call and they know what you want to populate into your CRM. And so they're, if I ask you what your job title is and you tell me, it's typing it into Salesforce or HubSpot while we're having the conversation in real time. And so to your point, I mean, that would have been real helpful for me when I was on the phones. I used to spend, 15, 20 minutes, going into Salesforce afterwards, getting your notes, filling out all the little timestamps and stuff. And we're quickly getting to a place where this stuff is just happening for us. So I guess on one hand, people could say that's replacing salespeople if they can have fewer salespeople, but your point, I think, is more accurate. It's a process that's changing and evolving.
Okay, now I'm going to draw the analogy down here of digging a hole in sand, right? Like imagine you got to dig a hole somewhere, back-breaking shovel work, right? Like literally, like there's not much things that get me not excited than it is digging a hole in the ground, right? And now we invent a backhoe, right? Like a digging machine, right? Whatever, we invent a backhoe who's grabbing. Does any of the people who are standing there with a shovel in their hand go like, oh my God, I hate that this backhoe is taking my job away, right? No.
Exactly.
Look, digging a hole was never intended to be a human job. Humans were not born with a shovel in hand to dig a hole. We needed to do that. Same thing down here. When you say a lot of salespeople are going to be out of a job, the different way is we use salespeople, we used human labor for the time being to fill a gap that was never meant to be. Selling was never meant to be a person placing 1,000 phone calls. That was not how it was supposed to be. But hey, and nobody is supposed to send 1,000 single emails, then automated and so on and so forth. All these jobs that we've created were never meant to be jobs in the first place. And they will, like metal when it's rusting, will turn to its natural state. And its natural state is that we have overhired 3x the amount of salespeople in the world than we really need in B2B.
And a lot of that compounds into the problem we talked about earlier, which they have to grow at all costs because they have to spend all this money too. And so a lot of these problems almost start to solve themselves if you can actually become more efficient by actually not needing all this human labor to do these tedious tasks. And, it dates back. I mean, you can use any example. They used to have a job title that was called calculator, and they would use an abacus, right? They had these little beads on these things then they would count things. Eventually we came out with spreadsheets and calculators, and those people are just gone, right? Like they move on to doing different work. And so I do like the notion of thinking about it like, the more we free ourselves of doing tedious tasks or manual labor, the more we can move on to doing more important things. And so whether that, they can be viewed as there will be less salespeople, are they losing their job? I don't think that's the right way to look at it, because to your point, like if we looked at anything that way, we wouldn't have evolved to where we're at, right? We would still be dragging things on the ground instead of using the wheel.
Okay, so now this draws then the analogy, where are we going to forward? If that's not it. And what you're going to see moving forward, human beings to human beings communicating, the form of using communities, events, and maybe events in a smaller scale. I think the events like Dreamforce, where we do on a large scale and where we every year need to outdo the number of people attending the previous year, that primarily, that mindset of volume is the same as email volume, is the same as call volume. And instead, what we're going to see is companies are going to do more and more roadshows to particular cities where they meet with customers, maybe 20 customers instead of like hundreds of customers. And these events that we're throwing once a year, yes, that will still be in place, like go to San Francisco and so on for this event, or to New York for that event, or to London for that event. But primarily those events are there to get introduced to new people. What you'll see, Collin, today, and you've learned this over the years, I'm sure as well, is nothing is a better lead than a peer-to-peer reference.
Yep.
All day long, I can talk about like, I did this research, ChatGPT did that. Then I call a person and say like, hey, what did you buy? Oh, I bought this. Why did you buy it? And they tell me the 3 things they like and the 3 things why they did it. And I go like, okay, that's what I want. And so like a lot of that on B2B right now, do I like when I buy a product online that on Amazon, I have 385 stars, 5 rating? Yes, that gives me confidence. But why did I look that product up on Amazon, right? Like, where did I start off with? You're going to see this in person. In B2B sales is going to play a prominent role moving forward, a more prominent role.
And I'm already seeing it, actually. You just said that, and I've seen people scheduling road shows. they're getting, custom wraps put around a bus, and they're going to go out and visit all these cities and sort of have these small town type meetups. And what's interesting about that is not only is it more effective, right? If you can have an intimate group and almost make it a bit exclusive, you're going to have real conversations, it's going to be real value, and it doesn't dilute itself, right? Like I remember when I joined, it's called Pavilion today. It's a huge community. When I joined it, it was called the Revenue Collective. It was a small group of people who met up for dinner in New York City. And, eventually they raise a bunch of money, they become this big entity, and they can provide value to more people. But I'd argue the value they used to add at those small dinners is hard to find now when you go to such a big, a large event where everyone's pushing something on everyone. And what I think probably makes a lot of sense for road shows is they can get the best of both worlds, because they can have that intimate, sort of marketing sort of energy, but they can record it and turn it into content that can then be put on YouTube for the world to see. And so you almost get the best of both worlds there.
Yeah, and indeed. So Pavilion, the event like the GTM Summit coming up in October, I believe, right? Which is a large event. You go there to gather, then you cherry pick out. But what you're now seeing, which is already happening in the past, it was like, oh, but then you get your golf game in with XYZ, right? Nowadays, that is like these salon dinners. Meet with a group of your peers, have dinner at an event like that, and then what they at Pavilion do in a structured way, have a conversation with each other where you share best practices in a group of like 10, 15 people, right? Like that's the way on how knowledge gets passed on these days by peers in your industry or those who are slightly ahead. So that is an example of how Pavilion does that, but there's obviously plenty of other examples on how this can be done. I think that this is AI proof for the coming years to be. This is a good area to invest in. I think that this is many companies feel very natural at doing this. Most companies, particularly SaaS companies, are already distributed across the globe. So to do a city tour in Europe and in America is like, oh, can you ask your European employees to do the European trip and your American employees to do the American route? So all that will work. What were the next questions? Which ones do we have left?
Well, we've got one more, which is really, will there be a return of growth at all costs? And I think I can sense your answer, which is probably that it won't, although maybe that will be the same cycle we'll see play out in some new industry, right? Like maybe AI will go through its own growth at all costs, period. And it sort of seems like it's like when something's real exciting, I'm sort of building upon my theory based on what I've learned from you today, which is it's almost like when there's an exciting industry or there's something that's big and explosive in the world and we want to advance it fast, we just throw money into it and just blow it up, get a lot of people into it, let them become passionate about it. But at a certain point, we got to reel it in a little bit and get efficient and make this thing really work. Am I piecing that together correctly?
Yeah, that's right. But throwing money at it is actually a proven methodology. In order, right? It's like throwing a bunch of seeds on the ground and see which tree grows the tallest is a very natural progression of growth progression, right? Like nature works that way. It gives abundant resources to an entire forest, but only one will be the tallest tree, so to speak. So down here in this is the same thing. So throwing money at it is a form of fertilizing the ground and letting organizations grow. And see which one succeeds. And it allows money. If you go back, Collin, if you wouldn't do it that way, if you go back to historic growth, there's HP is 100+ years old, I believe, right? Like many companies, no, HP is younger. HP is about 50 years old. But companies like Fiat and Renault are like 100+ years old, right? Like Nokia, I think, is one of the oldest companies of large-scale companies. I think 150 years old. The way how they grow without throwing money at it means I got to sell what I have on the truck, got to make a profit with it. Then I got to use that profit to expand my business next year. And I keep doing that slowly every year and grow up. Then I have economic setbacks on average about every 8 to 10 years, which takes me 2 steps back and I got to start all over again, right? That is how historic growth works. Now, what we just experienced is an incredible amount of growth between the longest time between two crises, 2008 and 2012, that's about like 14, 15 years of economic setbacks that SaaS experienced wild growth. The previous before that was 2001, 2002, when the dot-com bubble burst. It was seven years. So it's like you left for the summer. It rained, over for the 7 weeks that you were gone. You come back and your yard is fully grown with all kind of like weeds and whatnot, right? Like that has happened, and we're going to simply see, like some beautiful things happen. Some beautiful trees are going to come out of it, and some weeds need to be whacked. In this case, in this analogy, it's very normal. That's my point. It's like we shouldn't frown upon it. It's part of the process, and we leverage the tools that were given to us over the past decade. Now, moving forward, will growth at all costs still play? Absolutely. In vertical markets, it can have a fantastic application. Those vertical markets probably are not marketing and sales tools, right? But more like veterinarians and doctors and lawyers and very specific vertical markets that, people who own a fitness shop or individual train like that. That is a vertical market that will work. That may still work well.
And a lot of that is they want to grab the market share, right? Sometimes that's the main reason is you want to move first, you want to get in there, and you need money to move fast, right?
That's right. And so when you grow fast like that, now, there's other ways of doing it, right? I think that people forgo that. Like if you look back at the story of Airbnb, and it has the clues in it, right? Like most businesses take place in if they take place in the density of a city. You shouldn't rely on email. You can actually go into the stores themselves. You can go into bakeries, ask for the manager of the store, and sell to French bakeries in the Silicon Valley. They're probably 100, but they're drivable, right? You don't need to email them and seek for their email address. You can find their mailing address openly by doing a Google Map search, and you could visit them if you wanted to sell bakery machines to bakers in Silicon Valley. Right, so like physical visits like that can once again become very lucrative, particularly since we have such dense cities with LA, San Francisco, Atlanta, Miami, and so on and so forth, London, Amsterdam. Right, you can walk and meet dozens of customers within a few miles.
Got it. If you don't mind, we got a couple minutes. I'll throw one more at you with all of this change that's coming or not coming, but sort of happening. Lots of consolidation going on through this phase, bigger companies acquiring the smaller ones. And how much does this change the go-to-market process and the building of an MVP? Do you foresee, over the last 10 or 20, whatever years in SaaS, it's been the type of game where if I knew how to code, I could, spend some time in my apartment and build an MVP and maybe find a co-founder or two, and I can launch a product, raise a bunch of money. Do you see that changing? Is it now going to become more exclusive? Is it going to be bigger companies that have some sort of an advantage over smaller entrepreneurs? Or do you see sort of the barrier to entry staying the same? Or maybe does it get easier? Does it mean a guy like me, who I don't even know how to code, but I'm going to now have no code, and AI tools that can help me build an MVP? What direction do you see that going in? Does it get easier for the small entrepreneur or harder to get a SaaS company off the ground?
It will be easier to get it off the ground. It will be harder to scale it to, like, let's say 100 million. And so now MVP, minimal viable product, is often very dependent on product development. Product market fit, which is when you get your first, let's say, $1 million in sales, will be achievable quicker. And what you'll see today is that lots of entrepreneurs can get relatively a $1 to $2 million business off the ground based on the tools and the low cost nature of the infrastructure that is provided to it. To grow beyond 10 to 10 million is really hard, and from 10 to 100 million is even harder. But what you'll see when you grow from that, what is a required skill set is historically go-to-market fit. Can we find a way on how we sell to the customer? Now, Collin, on this last part, there is the key. What we see companies need, that big companies have a trouble with, is their go-to-market motions need to dynamically adjust based on how the buyer is changing their buying behavior. And today, they are not capable of doing that. So let me describe to you the asymmetry between buying and selling. Historically, the reason why we needed sales profession is because there was an asymmetry between the knowledge. The seller had a lot more knowledge because they were selling to the same customers every day, and they represented the solution. So they sat on this wealth of information, which when you visited the customer, made the customer want to buy from you, which coincidentally developed the demand for the need for trust, right? Trust was an important thing. I trust my seller, and that's the reason why we wanted human contact. What we now see is that this asymmetry of knowledge has flipped because of AI. AI is benefiting the buyer more than it is benefiting the seller right now. With AI, I can create a relatively quick, simple, I can ask what's the difference between this company and that company. That gives me a lot more detailed information than if I'm a seller, I have to say, I need to sell to this company. What can you tell me? Today, this asymmetry has flipped so much so that it is now the buyer who has more information than the seller. And therefore, in many cases, the buyer goes like, why do I need this sales professional on the call with me for? They don't know their own product even really well, right? Which again,
I think it was 80%. You're touching on a lot of the stuff that I have in my sales course called the Modern Outbound System, where we dove into pretty much what you're talking about, which is this transition from the seller holding all the keys to the kingdom. Like, if you want to know about my product, you got to talk to me. Whereas now the buyers are getting 80+% of the way through the journey on their own. They want to find all the information and sort of come well equipped to that conversation. I would argue they're also becoming just better at buying and better at negotiating. I think people have just been through the process so many times now that they're a bit more defensive there. And so, what I talk a lot about there, curious to get your thoughts before we jump here, is that a lot of the sales process is becoming asynchronous, whereas it used to be synchronous. We used to have a live conversation like this, whereas a lot of it now is sort of happening offline, and the salespeople need to be good at providing resources along the way, providing value, to your point, so that they're, actually serve a purpose in the process.
Yeah. So this change that we're seeing, that you're referring to, asynchronous communication, this is the time that we come out of, right? The COVID really helped us with the asynchronous and the mindset and adopting that fast that we otherwise would have.
Yeah.
Now, asynchronous has two elements of it, and those elements are out of time, and because we go out of time, we don't need to be at the same location any longer, right? Which gives us the ability to remote sell. What we see, the next one that we are currently are experiencing, is that time, yes, asynchronous, we can still happen, but people want to go back and want to meet with that person, right? And again, at Winning by Design, we've helped over 1,100 companies to grow from that, often from 10 million to $1 billion, go public. And what we start to see is that most organizations do not adopt themselves very well along that journey. They keep whatever works, but they don't adopt to it. So their mindset keeps the same. That is an Achilles heel for organizations moving forward. Can you adjust your go-to-market motion to the way the buyer is changing their buying behavior fast enough that you can capture that? And if not, that, like a product that misses a key feature and your competitor comes out with a key feature and therefore outmaneuvers you, same way your competitor can outmaneuver you because their go-to-market motion is better and more premium. Now, like cost at all cost, and growth, to bring it back to the beginning, we said at the beginning, hey, growth is more valuable in the valuation of a company than cost is, and therefore it costs growth at all costs. The same thing down here, go-to-market motions will have a certain value compared to product. Now, historically, we have said, product will fix all go-to-market motions. It's product at all costs at this point in time, right? Oh, if I have a great product, look, Slack is still a fantastic product. And, like Zoom, which we're on today, is a fantastic product. Product will help. What we see, that no longer is the mindset of the future, because everybody is now based on the same AI systems, using the same AI. And so suddenly, all products start to look alike. And I'm certain that if you're listening to this podcast right now, that you go to yourself, is like, anything else that comes out with now AI enabled, you're already fatigued. And we're only 18 months in, right? So what we're going to see is that product no longer is that big of a differentiator as it once was. And nowadays, grow to market is becoming the real differentiator. Is this really a company I would love to do business with? When I speak to the people, are they really experts in what they do?
Sort of that secret sauce, that white glove treatment, right? How do you make it actually worth it? Because I think if it does get easier to build, we're going to get to a place where people could just build a lot of their own tools and not even buy something. So you have to give them reasons, right, to do a lot of this.
Collin, as you know, and as well as I do about Starbucks, Starbucks is a fantastic chain. Starbucks ain't competing with another big coffee chain. Starbucks is competing with hundreds in every location. If you look around it, there's 6 different little boutique-style coffee shops, right, where people buy from. Is the coffee cheaper there? Probably it's about the same price. Why? They like the atmosphere, the human atmosphere of that it has. And so what you're going to see, and more when I enter in Starbucks centers, they don't have the parking spots, and therefore they have to get rid of all the seats. And you now walk into a Starbucks and there's one table, right? And you go like, okay, this is not a comfortable space to be in. And you go to your neighborhood coffee shop in order to get your coffee. Same thing with technology. What you see there is product and go-to-market in full swing. And what I see and what I'm saying is, companies who control that go-to-market motion are going to be successful in the next decade.
And that brings you back to your brand and your community, right? Because it's a big chunk of value to be built there.
Yeah, and yes. And so for us at Winning by Design, we special in go-to-market. We do all that kind of stuff that you know me well for, and the videos that I've created and the books I've written.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. For those who maybe don't know you well or what you do, who should come to Winning by Design? Who needs your help, and how do they find you?
We help companies with the go-to-market motion, B2B, recurring revenue. So if you're dependent on future revenues of your customers, then and you're over $10 million, that's the range that we work in. Written a book on this topic called Revenue Architecture, available on Amazon. And our website is winningbydesign.com, as simple as it can be, I would say. And yeah, and I think that I'm having a question for you, Collin. What was your key takeaway? What was the one key takeaway that you picked up on today that you hadn't heard before, that you go like, oh, that's a fresh way of looking at it?
Well, you got me thinking bigger in the sense of I've only been thinking about the golden age, and you really made me realize that I've just lived through that. And so I have not connected the dots myself to the fact that this is actually a cycle that every industry has gone through. I have really laser focused myself on the why, which has been in my head a lot about the financial. Some of it has to do with greed. Some of it has to do with, just trying to boost up a valuation of a business. But you got me to see that really this is sort of a growth phase. And while some of what I'm saying might be true, or even all of it might be true, there's a bigger picture here, which is that there's an evolution of these industries. And that is something I had not considered yet. So I've got a lot to think about now, and I need to reevaluate sort of a lot of this. I think it doesn't necessarily mean I'm wrong with the things I was saying, but I was looking at a very small piece of a much bigger topic.
Yeah, and what you'll find is, like, if you go back and you compare ourselves to the healthcare industry and hospitals, we are still having sages and how do you call it, soapbox doctors at markets selling their elixir, right? Like, that's the world that we're in. We're still cutting legs off, bloodied, and calling that we're fixing somebody's leg, right? Hospitals have been invented yet. The trade of doctors hasn't been invented yet. Operational, as in physical operation procedures, hasn't been invented yet. This is the time where we're in. Now, we're going to get there faster than it took the medical industry, and much can be learned from the 1960s, when robots entered and when we started to understand what quality and quality measurement meant. That's the era that we're going in. It's an exciting era. And for all of you excited about it, and are listening to this podcast, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining. Thanks for sharing your wisdom. Everyone, check out winningbydesign.com if you need help. And where should people follow you? I know you're on LinkedIn. Are you also doing Twitter, YouTube? Are you elsewhere, or is LinkedIn the main spot?
LinkedIn and YouTube are the main spot. So LinkedIn is where you find the brief summaries, and YouTube you find the more detailed research.
Excellent.
And of course, the number one thing is the book is on Amazon.
So check out the book. And thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.